Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to our show. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here today with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Howdy, guys. How's it going?
Good.
Man, doing well.
Awesome. Great to be with you guys. Listeners, it's great to have you back here for our third season where we're looking at the Tanakh. And as we've talked about so much in our episodes thus far, we're developing how Second Temple literature takes these themes and ideas, stories, situations, words from the Tanakh, and plays them out, and then we see how they're developed in the lives of, in the words of Jesus, and in the writings of the apostles. So a couple of episodes ago, we began to talk about Abraham. We spent some time developing the election of Abraham and how that came out of the Tower of Babel and God's choice of a people group to be the family or be the nation through which all the rest of the families of the earth would be blessed. And we saw how that laid forth the whole foundation of the redemptive narrative that we see laid out in the scriptures.
Yeah. Then last week we had our interview with Rabbi Joshua Berman, which was awesome. I just so enjoy getting to connect with him. That was great. So we talked a little bit about his scholarship on the Torah and kind of how he engages critical scholarship. He also went over things related to the election of Abraham and God's kind of God creating what he called a national culture among Abraham's descendants to walk out, life as a holy people amidst the other nations. And that was just an excellent episode. He fleshed out some of the nuances of election that I think were really important moving forward.
Yeah.
Great. This week we want to highlight the apocalyptic reality of how Jews viewed Abraham and how they theologized basically about Abraham, pushing that narrative from the Torah, that historical narrative, to its ultimate end, and putting Abraham in context to the resurrection, the day of judgment, eternal life. And Abraham's a major player in that. Besides Enoch and Adam, Abraham's one of the main guys that becomes kind of the basis of the hope of the future for Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. So in what we want to look at today, I think is really important as we look at some stories from Second Temple literature. And really we want to see, like we've done so much in our season thus far, to see how they contribute to the understanding of Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament. Now, when it comes to Abraham, I think we're really accustomed to hearing about Abraham and the idea of faith in the Christian tradition. And Christian tradition really frames the conversation about Abraham and about his faith very differently than Second Temple literature and thus the rest of the New Testament. And so we think the best way to frame the conversation is to look back and see, okay, how did the Second Temple period authors and how did the New Testament frame faith and eternal life? And I think we're going to see that it's definitely different than what goes on in the modern conversation about faith and Abraham.
Indeed. Yep. Luther is not a good backdrop for the New Testament. Don't read the New Testament in light of Luther. Read it in light of who they were reading. And then if you want to read Luther later, that's great.
Totally.
He's not the
we'll
context.
We'll make Abraham great again today.
There we go.
By adding eschatology.
Just add eschatology, and that's what makes it great again.
You should make like a hat or something with that on it. Maybe just an acronym.
Abraham.
Yeah. It'd have to be blue, not red, though.
Right.
So when we talk about Abraham in Christian circles, we kind of have a certain way of reading Abraham. And I don't even have to explain it because you guys all know it if you're Christians or if you've been raised around a Christian tradition. But what I think we'd like to go over today is the fact that there was not only an existing conversation about Abraham, he was also very important to the narrative, and it did involve Jewish election and kind of the plan for redemption. But Abraham, the conversation related to Abraham also related a lot to eschatology, a lot more than you might think if you've kind of been viewing the New Testament through the lens of, some of the reformers or through Augustine, which is kind of what Christian tradition turned into. But Abraham and those stories really relate to eternal life and the resurrection of the body and things like that.
Yeah, so I think, the clearest example would be out of 4th Ezra, and 4th Ezra has 7 visions. The first one is basically just a recounting of Israel's history and tradition. And in that context, it starts with Adam and pushes right through to the end of the age and the coming of the day of God and Messiah and such. And so in chapter 3, it goes from Adam to Noah, and then it picks up in verse 12. It says, after the flood, when those who dwelt on the earth began to multiply, they produced children and peoples and many nations. And again, they began to be more ungodly than were their ancestors. And when they were committing iniquity before you, you chose for yourself one of them whose name was Abraham, and you loved him. And to him only you revealed the end of the times secretly by night. You made an everlasting covenant and promised him you would never forsake his descendants. So there's the binding together of the choosing of Abraham with the wickedness of the nations, so the election of Abraham. But that's in context to the revelation of the future, ultimately pushed to its ultimate end, the end of the age, the end of time. And so you get both of these kind of focused on in Jewish apocalyptic literature.
Yeah. Another passage I think of that reveals this same sort of end time and the judgment to Abraham is the Apocalypse of Abraham, chapter 22, verses 3 through 5. And just, I think this is showing, just as you said, John, how Abraham is interpreted in light of the broader eschatological apocalyptic narrative for these guys. So this is the Apocalypse of Abraham, chapter 22, verse 3. It says, "And I said, O Lord, mighty and eternal, who are the people in this picture on this side and on that?" He had seen this picture where people, they're on the left side and the right side, and this is what the Lord is explaining. And he said to me, "Those who are on the left side are all those born before your day and afterwards, some destined for judgment and restoration, and others for vengeance and cutting off at the end of the age. But those on the right side of the picture, they are the people who have been set apart for me, whom I have ordained to be born of your line and called my people, even some of those who derive from Azazel." Okay, so you kind of get this division of people, but it's in light of eschatology. It's in light of the end of the age and the final judgment.
Yeah, so we don't normally think that maybe something related to Abraham might lie behind, for example, Jesus' parable in Matthew 25.
Right.
But it's actually difficult now. It's one of those things you can't unsee. Once you know this, you look at Matthew 25, and there's at least a correlation. It's hard to see that there's not some sort of interplay there.
Yeah, so Matthew 25, the parable of Jesus, dividing between the sheep and the goats.
Yeah.
Right? And they
the
stand
right
before
hand
Son
and the
of
left
Man.
hand. And
Exactly.
One to eternal judgment, one to eternal life.
Right.
Right. The Apocalypse of Abraham is a little different, but the same basic idea is that Abraham was, what was revealed to him in dream and vision was the heavens and the earth and the end of the age. And so that's what they associated with Abraham was kind of the beginning of that narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's Apocalypse of Abraham is a little bit unusual. Well, I guess all the apocalyptic literature is. It's you got to appreciate it for what it is. Like even later on in chapter 29, there's kind of the revealing of the idea of 2 ages to Abraham, which is a cool little section. But so take note, Apocalypse
but
of
even that's a little weird.
A little bit. There's the kissing of Azazel. It's
But I mean, anybody who's been involved in the charismatic world, it's pretty mild. It's not that
right. Yeah. We've all seen stuff weirder than that in a meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So also know the Apocalypse of Abraham is probably a contemporary work with a lot of the New Testament.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily a building block for the ideas of the New Testament, but it represents tradition that was current during that time. Sometimes those are equally as important as some of the older works, because you realize these ideas are currently circulating. They're currently being discussed. So that's another thing that's interesting about the Apocalypse of Abraham.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think another cool passage that plays out this eschatological orientation of Abraham is in 2 Baruch, specifically 2 Baruch 4. And we're going to see, even I'll just read it here, but common themes that perhaps you'll be familiar with when you think of a passage like Hebrews 11, right? So 2 Baruch 4, the context here is about the city of Jerusalem and the siege of the city of Jerusalem. And the Lord is revealing to Baruch what the future Jerusalem is going to look like. So this passage here in 2 Baruch 4, starting at verse 3, it says, "Is it not this building that is in your midst now? It is that which will be revealed with me, and that which is already prepared from the moment that I decided to create paradise. And I showed it to Adam before he sinned. But when he transgressed the commandment, it was taken away from him, as also paradise. After these things, I showed it to my servant Abraham in the night between the portions of the victims. And again, I showed it also to Moses on Mount Sinai, when I showed him the likeness of the tabernacle and all its vessels. Behold, now it is preserved with me, as also paradise."
Yeah, so that's again, there's good evidence here that this way of thinking about Abraham is actually the way the New Testament authors were thinking about Abraham. So like Hebrews 11,
Yeah.
That's fairly familiar passage. People call that the Hall of Faith or whatever. But so essentially, this is the same way that they frame Abraham, because they're thinking of Abraham in terms that he was aware of a future restored city of Jerusalem. And so like when in Hebrews 11 verse 10, it frames the faith of Abraham in terms of going into the land of Israel, looking with his eyes and then pitching a tent versus building a house. And it says this was an expression of faith because Abraham was actually looking for a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so the idea was in Hebrews, and if you just read the narrative in Genesis and then you jump up to Hebrews, you're like, oh, that's creative. But this was the common way that they were thinking about Abraham, that Abraham hadn't just broadly seen the idea of eschatology, of the resurrection, but here real specifically, God showed Abraham this future restored city of Jerusalem. And so the reference in Hebrews 11 that his faith is that he anticipated that, and so that's why he didn't feel need to colonize the area at that point, because he knew that there was a city coming from God. And then what's implied there in Hebrews is that his faith is represented in the fact that he knew that he would be raised from the dead one day in order to see it.
Yeah, so profound. So profound.
Right. And I think, Hebrews 11 is a great example, because right after that he said, all these died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And so, it's a basic assumption that interpreting the scriptures and, the Jewish narrative this way is a discipleship mechanism.
Absolutely.
That it's not just that it's the best way to interpret the scriptures.
Right.
It's that this is what keeps people's eyes looking forward and not attached to the things of this age and this life. And it's the explanation for why they were saints is because of their eschatological hope.
Yeah.
So anyway, a lot of the literature, surrounding the time that references Abraham kind of fills in the biblical narrative with eschatological context. So later on in 2nd Baruch, you get the cloud apocalypse, where Baruch is, redemptive history is revealed to Baruch in a series of clouds, bright and dark clouds, kind of ups and downs in Israel's history. And Abraham is the major bright cloud after the dark cloud of the flood and the Tower of Babel. And so it says in 2 Baruch 57, and after these you saw the bright waters, that is the fountain of Abraham and his generation, and the coming of his son and the son of his son, and of those who are like them. For at that time the unwritten law was in force among them, and the works of the commandments were accomplished at that time, and the belief in the coming judgment was brought about, and the hope of the world which will be renewed was built at that time, and the promise of the life that will come later was planted. Those are the bright waters which you have seen. And so you get this kind of, Abraham's the father of faith, not just of the creation of the Jewish people or the election of the Jewish people, but he's the father of faith, of the hope of the Jewish people and the eschatology of Israel.
Yeah. Really
Love
good.
it. That's such a sweet passage there. And so, which also is reminiscent, again, tethering it back to a passage or concept in the New Testament. It's like in Romans 4, right? In verse 13, you have Abraham, that God revealed to him that he would be the heir of the world. This is kind of where the concept comes from. And that verse 17, he's the one that Abraham's faith, this is also repeated in Romans or in Hebrews 11, that Abraham's faith was tethered to his conviction that God would raise the dead. Like, that's why Abraham believed God. Not that Abraham just believed that God would turn it around necessarily in his lifetime, though some of the things God did turn around in his lifetime, but his faith was actually not in that moment, but in the future, in the resurrection. So they're talking about the same thing if you can strip it from kind of the world that you've had it in, in the Christian world. It's pretty dang cool what they're actually talking about.
Yeah, right. And it's not that a lot of the theologizing about the death of the Messiah is bad. We're not
Right.
down on Luther for that.
No,
at all.
no.
A lot of the reformers and Luther and their theologizing about atonement and justification, these kinds of things are good. They're just completely out of context.
Right.
And
Justified for
Romans,
Right.
Right. And Romans 4, it's Paul's building his argument for the death of the Messiah justifying us in light of the coming judgment based on Abraham's faith in the hope of the resurrection. Therefore, God justified him. And if we have the same faith in what God has done and what he's going to do, then God will justify us based on our faith in the death of the Messiah on our behalf. But it's like if you're, I use the example of an alphabet, like if you don't have A, B, and C, the beginning of the biblical narrative, along with X, Y, and Z, the end of the biblical narrative, the resurrection day of God, then the middle of the L, the M, and the N, and the death of the Messiah loses meaning and context, right? So Jewish eschatology is what Paul drew the context and meaning for the death of the Messiah in light of those events. Romans 5, right after that, starting with Adam, leading to the resurrection and eternal life at the end. And that's what makes the death of the Messiah sacrificially as an atonement make sense for him. That's what gave it context and meaning. But if you kind of extract it out of that native Jewish apocalyptic context, then it just becomes, a little bit abstract,
like
disconnected.
Jesus died for you to give you a nice, comfortable life. And, It has no connection to eschatology, the day of judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and these realities that were so central to the apocalyptic narrative that was common during the Second Temple period and during the times of the authors of the New Testament.
That, or people insert their own eschatology. Like you said, Jesus died for us unto our eschatology, the American dream eschatology, unto whatever end game you're trying to attain.
Yeah. So like you're saying, it really is, it's really, the question is justification unto what? And so it's when we mess up that question that the conversation that they're having gets confusing. So like in Romans 15, we have the kind of where he kind of wraps a lot of the ideas together, and he says these things happen that we might have hope and to confirm the promises that were given to the patriarchs. So this is kind of how he's wrapping up the things related to Jesus and the death, and he's kind of putting them together at the end. The conversation also reminds me a little bit of Acts 7. There's this strange. So it's when Stephen's standing before the high priest in the Sanhedrin, and he's kind of beginning to give a defense because he's standing to kind of give a defense of whatever, and he makes this statement, which is kind of how there was a tradition, from back in Deuteronomy and the Psalms and through the prophets, that often the oracles of God were actually presented in narrative form. They began with Israel's history, and the logic of Israel's history actually started to tell the story in itself. The logic of how history had unfolded made the apocalyptic end all the more reasonable.
Right.
And so, if you understand this in the conversation that's being had, you look at how Stephen starts the conversation. It says, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our ancestor Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. And he said to him, 'Leave your country and your relatives, go to the land I will show you.' And he left the country of the Chaldeans. He settled in Haran. After his father died, God moved him." And so it's like, why are you telling us this, right? Like everybody knows these stories. It's the high priest of Israel.
Yeah.
But then he goes, "God moved him there to this country in which you are now living. But he did not give him any of it as a heritage, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as a possession." And so the whole thing he's building, he's going to defend the teaching, and basically the teaching of Jesus in context to Abraham not having received the inheritance yet.
Right.
And so this is how he starts to build the entire narrative. It's like this apocalyptic narrative that he's hitting him with. And he's like, to begin with, we all know that God promised him that he would be the heir of this land, and he didn't inherit any of it yet. And so he's like projecting this future apocalyptic. The conclusion is that Abraham has to inherit it after the resurrection. And so this is kind of how they framed the narrative of redemption, especially in terms of Abraham. That one comes to mind often.
Yeah, Bill, for sure. I think this is what really frames so much of the conversation around Abraham. As we've been talking about, in context to Abraham's faith, it is understood in terms of his hope for eternal life in the resurrection on the day of the Lord at the day of judgment. And this is the context of understanding it in the New Testament. So passages like, Romans 4, Galatians 3, when we're talking about faith, when we're talking about Abraham's faith, it's in context to eternal life and the resurrection, not primarily just faith for a good life, faith for a revival in our city, faith for this, faith for that. It is faith for the resurrection of the dead at the day of judgment, and a city who has foundations, whose builder and maker is God.
Yeah, and so you get different things in Abraham's life if on both those last two passages, or the last three that we talked about, 4th Ezra 3 and 2nd Baruch 4, the revelation of the end of the age happened secretly at night. The night that they're referencing is Genesis 15.
Right.
When God makes the covenant with Abraham, the animals are killed. And as the sun sets, he falls into a sleep and the smoking pot. And then in the apocalypse of Abraham, the whole apocalypse happens around that event. Like that's the main event. All of the revelation. So you get a lot of emphasis specifically on Genesis 15, but then you also get commentary in apocalyptic literature around Genesis 22. And the binding of Isaac, in Hebrew, the term is Akedah. And so it's just, in Jewish tradition, it's referred to as the Akedah or the binding. And so Abraham's faith is tested with the binding of Isaac. And out of that kind of interaction, you get the hope, the confirmation of the election of Abraham. And behind the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is Abraham's faith in the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
Which you also pick up in Hebrews 11 that what allowed Abraham to follow through on his faith was his eschatological hope.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the citations, remember, we're not talking about chapter and verse that people are familiar with. They're familiar with stories, and so as they kind of elaborate or write commentary, some of the citations are a little bit loose in that they'll look later at the Akedah in Genesis 22, and they'll even sometimes even insert the phrase, "That's when it was credited to him as righteousness." So because basically the concept of Abraham's faith was always related to Abraham's faith in eternal life and that God could raise the dead.
Right.
And so generally the kind of the banner of Abraham's faith is always related to resurrection, eternal life, and the promises related to the future.
Yeah, in apocryphal materials, specifically like Judith 8 and 1 Maccabees 2, you get specific references to Abraham and the time of his testing. And like 1 Maccabees 2, was it not Abraham found faithful when tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? And then it goes down the list. Joseph in the time of his distress, Phinehas, Joshua, Caleb, David, Elijah, Daniel. And so it's the same, it's the same kind of listing of faith heroes that you get like in Hebrews 11. But what the driver behind that, what gave that meat, was the commonly held eschatology. And so it wasn't just Abraham's faith that he believed God was real and that he entrusted, his soul to God, which is good. We're not downplaying that. Yeah. But the entrusting of our souls to God is in context to an apocalyptic narrative, an eschatological hope that gives meaning to why we're entrusting our souls to God.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Yeah. Well, listeners, this is really what we hope you take away from today, is the eschatological thrust of Abraham, of how Second Temple literature develops Abraham and understands Abraham, and then thus how the New Testament authors understand Abraham, just because this is the way they were thinking about it, eschatologically oriented, right? Not just random, not just faith for something cool or faith for something fun in life, but faith for the resurrection of the dead and the age to come. And these are how all these themes are played out, how Abraham is understood throughout Second Temple literature in the Jewish mind, and thus into the New Testament. So as we close today, we want to encourage you, send us your questions. If you have questions on any of the material we've been developing here in season 3 of our show, make sure you send those to us. We are going to continue to do dedicated Q&A episodes like we've done in our first couple of seasons, where we'll take some time and answer your questions. So send those to us via the contact form on our website on apocalypticgospel.com. And we'd encourage you as well, if this podcast has been encouraging to you, leave us a review on the platform that you listen to us on, and give us a 5-star rating. That really helps with the algorithm to help others find this podcast as well. And so next time, what we want to do is we want to come in with a Q&A episode. This is our 9th episode in this season, and so it's time. It's time to take a bunch of the questions you've sent in and answer them for you. So we look forward to speaking with you next time on our Q&A episode, and then we'll continue our look at the Tanakh in episodes following that. So until then, listeners, thanks again for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless, and Maranatha.
Maranatha.
Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.